Today we're going to be discussing pop art, which is short for popular. So the subject matter here is going to pull from popular life, right? Popular things. So we're going to see a lot of advertising imagery, a lot of consumer objects as the subject matter here. Here I gave you a Calvin and Hobbes comic. This is from when I was young, so you may have never seen it, but if you've never seen Calvin and Hobbes, it's pretty funny. It's basically a boy and his stuffed tiger, right? And they're having this conversation here about art where he's Calvin's looking at the wall and he's saying, a painting, moving, spiritually enriching, sublime, high art, right? And then the comic strip, vapid, juvenile, commercial hackwork, low art. And then a painting of a comic strip, sophisticated irony, philosophically challenging, right? High art. And then Hobbes says, suppose I draw a cartoon of a painting of a comic strip. And he's like, no, sophomoric, intellectually sterile, low art. I use this comic because popular art, pop art, wanted to kind of break the wall between what was considered low and high art. High art we usually attribute to paintings, sculpture, architecture. In low art, we ascribe to craft, or things that are usable, things that are used in our culture, right? Advertising, let's say, we'd say that's low art. And these artists said, why do we have these definitions or these separations or these distinctions? It's kind of bullshit, What if we try to reboot, right? The idea of what is acceptable as high art. So that is really what drives the movement to sort of I'd say sort of level the playing field, to say we don't need to have this terminology anymore. We can use things that are considered low and make them high, right? And vice versa. So they're really examining that question. Now, what is the landscape of pop? Pop is also post World War II. But what I always think is that there's sort of a contrast between abstract expressionism and pop, and they're sort of fighting against one another. Abstract expressionism was more of a 1950s movement, and pop is more 1960s. So I think what happens is abstract expressionism sort of arises out of the turmoil of World War II, but takes it to a really cerebral place. And then pop says, people don't want that. They just went through a really difficult time. They want something fun, right? They want something anti-cerebral. They want something where you don't have to think too hard about it, right? There will be Warhol's famous quote, everyone's famous for 15 minutes. This idea of something that's easy to digest, easy to understand. You look at it and in 2 seconds you go, oh, it's a soup can, right? I know what that is. That it doesn't make people think too hard. They said that is the essence of what people want, and that is pop. And so they turn to things like advertising and consumerism because they realize that that is in our shared landscape, that you don't have to explain these things to people and that people think it's fun, people want to go out and grab a burger, people want to go grab some Fruit Loops off a shelf, right? It's colorful, it's, driven by passion and happiness and consumption. And so this is their fuel. And I'd say this is a very utopian vision. Pop is about happiness. It's not about anything that's hard or difficult. And if you really think about kind of what's going on at this time in America, there's a lot of centering on consumerism as something that means you are doing well, right? That you are prospering. There were a lot of programs coming out of World War II to help people own homes, help people, get social mobility. And, again, I think the idea of the great American home, the wife in the kitchen, right? All the new appliances, right? This was really being packaged to people as this means you've made it, right? This means you're happy. This means things are going well for you. And again, I think Americans are very unique in our sort of attachment to consumerism, advertising, right? And keeping up with the Joneses, as they say, that like, well, they got a big, huge, 60-inch screen TV. Like, I have to have that too, right? There's this sense that things will make you happy. And, you see that in our advertising quite prominently, where happiness is often correlated with buying, right? Happiness is, directly attributed to you got that new thing you wanted. So here you'll see an old ad for vacuum cleaners, right? On Christmas morning, she'll be happier with a Hoover. Now, today, of course, this would not track the same. buying an appliance for your girlfriend or wife, I think, would probably go over pretty badly unless she specifically asked for it. I know if my husband just came home with a blender, I'd be like, "What are you trying to say?" Because our gender roles have changed, right? Our gender roles are very, very different. In my home, actually, my husband is the cleaner. My husband cleans. He was in the military, so he's like, hardwired. I hate cleaning, so you know our gender roles have really flipped. But I think that you can still think about how ads are used to suggest that if you buy that new car or you get that new bikini, you're going to be happier, right? So this is a very American thing, I think. And artists really pick up on this and start to use this. The first artist we're going to look at is Claus Oldenburg and his wife Kuzi van Bruggen. They work together as a team, but Oldenburg usually gets a lot of the credit. So I want to make sure that Van Bruggen is noted, right, as part of this team. Oldenburg has passed on, right? Van Bruggen is still around making art. You can go out and look at their website and look at the kind of projects that they're doing. They start out on a smaller scale doing these smaller types of sculptures and later will turn to larger scale works. Um, and how did they really think about these small sculptures? They try to think about how they're presenting this type of artwork almost again as consumerist fuel. So, one of the first things they did when they first started making sculptures is start what we call the store. And they basically rented some commercial space in New York City and set it up what looks like at first like a gallery, in a sense, a traditional gallery, but then you'll notice it's filled with all these things that are not what you expect when you walk into a gallery, like a giant ice cream cone, a giant piece of cake, an umbrella, right? And they said they wanted to sort of conflate this idea of like a traditional art gallery and going into a store and just buying things. And they said we wanted people to come into the store and see objects that were familiar to them that sparked something in them. Like, oh, I know what an umbrella is. I know what a piece of cake is, right? And they said we wanted to have this sort of whimsical, silly kind of nature to these objects that people would feel that it was more approachable. Now, I'll put this through the lens of a typical gallery experience. I've been in the arts since I was like 14. And typically, when you go into a gallery, it's sort of a hushed experience. You're looking at the art. Usually, a gallerist comes over to you and it's like sort of like, can I help you? What do you think about the dynamic rhythm in these paintings? There's this sort of back and forth that happens. It's very sort of almost elitist. You know, you have to have some understanding of the art or the art experience to sort of feel comfortable in it. And I have to admit, I'm an art person and I kind of hate going in galleries and having people bother me. I'm like, just leave me be with my viewing, right? So there is sort of this tension and this. I think most people don't go into galleries because they feel like it's going to be a weird experience for them, right? So this is something that Oldenburg and Van Bruggen thought could be more inviting, could bring people into a space to look at art who maybe didn't typically feel comfortable with art. And everything here, by the way, was up for purchase. So anything in here you could buy, anything at all. From a large piece of the cake, which probably ran about like $1,000, down to these little tiny pieces you see on the tables that were like $1, $5, whatever. So they also said about this that we wanted to think about how you could make art more accessible to the everyday buyer by having the smaller pieces. They said, someone could say, "Hey, look, I bought this, little stick of gum, right, made out of plaster for $5, right? I'm an art collector." Right. So again, it changes this dynamic about who has access to, let's say, high art and how it can be purchased and how it can be used. So it's really fascinating what they were thinking about here, not just with the subject matter, but also the systemics of like how you buy art and consume art and interact with art. And so the earlier works, sort of are these smaller pieces. They fall into different categories. That you have the soft sculptures, like you see here. They're usually made out of like vinyl or parachute material or some kind of material like this. And then they also have harder sculptures that are made out of plaster, like the cigarette. And notice there's kind of this whimsy, these things that you're used to seeing from your environment, right? That you're used to interacting with your environment, and so they start out kind of smaller scale with these kind of works, and then later they move into what we call the large scale projects. Now, the large scale projects are probably what they're more well known for. These are things that are still being put out by their production company today. And notice that they're these monumental sculptures, but they're about like everyday things. Um, so you're sort of left going, okay, this is interesting. I never expected to be walking through a landscape and see like, it's almost like a giant has abandoned their badminton game. Because that's what you're seeing here. These are shuttlecocks that are used to play badminton, right? Um, And so, the dynamics of these everyday objects littered around like a giant dropped them. And again, I think anyone sees these works and says like, "Oh, how fantastical, how fun, how silly." I love this shot because you get the Nelson Atkins Museum in the background, which is a very traditional neoclassical looking structure. And then in the foreground, you have the shuttlecocks. It's such a nice play of old school art, new school art, and that kind of tension, right? By the way, I don't know this guy at all. He must have just loved, going to see Oldenburg sculptures. So I Googled him, right? So I don't know him, but um, again, you'll see they play with this idea of things that everyone can recognize. Here, the flashlight on UNLV's campus, it actually lights up at night. So it kind of functions as a safety measure for the students navigating around campus. But again, it's sort of fun, like, oh, flashlight, like, how silly, how fun. So I think that we can look at these works and really think about how they're trying to create a new dynamic for public sculpture, where it's not commemorative. Usually, public sculpture was commemorative, like look at this important guy on a horse or something, right? Or there's George Washington. So they're trying to create a new dynamic with this where anyone and everyone can interact with this type of public sculpture and I think feel comfortable, right, with what they're seeing and what they're experiencing. This is a piece that I saw at the Marfa Foundation. We'll talk more about Marfa when we get into our discussion of minimalism, and talk more about the Marfa Foundation and what its job is. But again, I love the whimsy of these. I just think it's really about changing the perspective of how people look at art and consume art.